you mentioned that, the agency, they have invested. And I think, like, as we mentioned, those first things are really about, like, often much of the ones we discussed are about having access to professional development, learning some tools that are often provided through professional development means. And I think some of it is, some of it's also on us as learners, as lifelong learners, right? So some of that is about, I'm a big reader. I love books. I like to have a diverse collection of books that I'm reading. And so, like, those things all inform us. So some of it's about, that work that you do in your workspace, and some of it's about the work that we do in our personal space, which kind of leads me to kind of the next section of things, the tools that I kind of wanted to talk about. So I guess, like, the kind of segue in between is, I think some things are a mix of learned and who we are, which is things like maybe birth order, which is kind of an interesting in-between one. When we look at birth order, for instance, it can inform things about, like, where we're born into a family. Like, how does that impact our lessons on culture, on how family dynamics work? What responsibilities existed for us that maybe didn't exist for our siblings based on the birth order that where we were born into our families. And then how does that play out in social structure, work hierarchy, or maybe it speaks to priorities, what you prioritize at work. A big one might be work-life balance. So things like birth order can have huge impacts, and knowing, again, it's not that knowing where you fall on some scale is going to determine where you end up. It's more about that awareness of, how does this impact my relationships? And one of the things I provided in the reference is just some really simple charts that kind of outline birth order and show you just a general understanding of how where you're born can impact your relationships in general.
And it's huge. My original path in life was to be a psychologist and a therapist. And so birth order was a huge part of something that we studied both in personality psychology, but also developmental psychology, coming from a large family where I'm kind of the middle child, the only girl, has proven specific dynamics for me that I can see and I'm very aware of, compared to my husband, who was pretty much an only child for most of his life and has a sibling who's multiple years younger than him. But he kind of grew up most of his time in his childhood home as an only child, a latchkey kid, right? Versus in my family, we were kind of always together. My parents were entrepreneurs and they took us to their work. But absolutely, I mean, it has, again, I think this is important as we just think a little bit about what might have an influence on how we see the world around us, see and interact with others, and how that might influence just the work that we do. I think that's an important piece. And this is a great time. Let me just pause for a moment and just say, the first week of the new year, everybody's got these New Year's resolutions. They've got, they're empowered. They've hopefully had some time off, some time with family. They've kind of got this new start for many who kind of adhere to those resolutions. This is a great place to just kind of ground yourself, take some baselines, identify some things that make you who you are. So as you plan out those resolutions, the focuses, the goals you have in different areas of your life, you might be able to be more successful with greater awareness. So
you made me think too, like, it's really, as we think about resolutions, for me, stuff has been a win-win. It's been a win for me professionally. It supports my coaching, but it certainly supports my personal relationships, my marriage, my relationship with my child. And we could talk about this birth order and sociology.
I know we can, especially because I just had my fourth. So now I'm like, well, now what did I do to that birth order? Yeah, I need to look back at that. Yeah.
And I came from a family of four with my dad had a previous marriage. So there were two step siblings as well, half siblings as well. And then I had an only child. So like for me, this has been a fascinating journey as a parent, to be a parent of an only, as someone who grew up in a very involved, like you said, a very close knit but big family. So yeah.
And my husband also go, like, why are they always fighting? I'm like, that's what we do. Like, that's what they love each other. Yes, I promise you, this is normal.
That's our love language.
Right. If they're not
Yeah.
yelling at each other sometime in the week, then we got to be worried, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And that's actually your point about your husband is a good point too, because, like you said, it informs who we work with, right? Like knowing, if you know that someone you're coaching is, for instance, an only child based on your work with them and your share, I mean, that certainly informs your communication, your language, much like it would with your husband.
right.
Just it helps inform that piece. So, yeah. So I think that
Yeah.
brings us to the knowing who we are and like what tools can we use to do that. So a couple of the things I just wanted to briefly talk about is I do think it's important to think about things like bias, privilege, and prejudice. I've done a lot of personal work for that. I'm a parent of a child on the LGBTQ plus spectrum. I was a cisgendered white middle-class male, grew up in a pretty stable social serving parents household that was pretty well off. My dad was a police officer. My mom was a child care provider. My experience as a child was very different than my own child's. I became hyper aware of that as being a parent who was very involved. We were we were very close. So I think, as we reflect, we want to make sure, because this stuff informs our lens, how we see things, right? EBI work as well, reflection helps us to be aware of the gaps and seek to fill those while we're seeking to share that power equally with those that we work with. And I think, it's important to just be aware that it's not a judgment, but our limited awareness is what we have. Our experience informs our ability to check these things, and being aware and providing space for other viewpoints, experiences, and perspectives, and nurturing the ability to let the power go or that control. That's a big one with teachers that I've worked with in the past, is really working on just letting go of that control. And what does that mean? And then, we're not always the expert, and that nor should we want to be, right? That's a lot of burden. And so when I think about knowing yourself better, knowing your own privilege, your prejudices, your biases, I think these are important to just inform you in that perspective taking and that reflective process, so that you are aware, what are my lenses, what are my gaps, where are my blind spots?
Yeah. And again, I see transferability from this awareness of myself into, being able to identify opportunities where the individual I'm supporting might be able to gain greater awareness so that they can better support their students, right? Or the teachers that they're coaching or supporting on their campus, if it's a principal or a coach that I'm working with. And I think that's huge, to just begin to, again, like you said, being open and aware for it. And that's a lot to hold on to. But again, I think what we're talking about is just taking some time to dive into yourself a little bit and reflect then on how this new knowledge, or maybe you do an assessment and you're like, yeah, that didn't tell me anything I didn't already know about myself. But how does that then inform my work with the individuals I'm working with? Or you and I are both kind of virtual coaches working at an wide variety of places. I work in multiple states and countries now, and just having that awareness of even just the students that my teachers are working with and the differences they have in equity compared to what I had growing up, or the students I worked with when I was a teacher. I think that's just, again, it's just something to be extremely mindful of in our practice that can be the difference between, early success and some more latent success down the road. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I mean, I think for me, oftentimes it is about, helping to transfer those skills to those that we work with, and understanding, oftentimes it's about, trauma, ACEs and resilience, and understanding these kids that we work with and what they've been through that might be different than our own experiences, or maybe they're similar, and maybe it's a way we can connect and relate.
Right.
So I think that, again, it's another piece that helps us understand. And then potentially once we understand it in ourselves, it allows us to provide it to others as a tool, as a transference. And then I would say kind of that the big one for the who we are for me is that personality style quiz. I use the Myers-Briggs. I do it actually pretty regularly. I do it, every year or so, every couple years, just to kind of see how things have shifted for me. But I do find that, that personality style, it impacts, how I interact with others, but it also impacts, I often will find that, as I'm doing these or using these tools, I would look at, leadership styles, and I would find that, my INTJ personality style fits right in with the leadership style that I choose. And why is that? Well, that seems to make perfect sense, right? And then that same thing is, like I see myself as a visionary, as a leader. Where do I fall as my personality style within that? And does that match, or is it a disconnect? And where are the areas that may be a disconnect? And how does that inform my own personal journey? So personality style is a huge one. And I think just much like the reflective practice, the personality style and who we are at our core, definitely informs and it hugely impacts our relationships and how we interact with the world.
Yeah. So true. So lots of tools that we can use to better understand, just our tendencies, our implicit biases, even just how we kind of function and play or work with others. So one other point that I want to make sure that we touch on today in your talk is just then, again, around that transferability and how we understand who our learners are. So, now that we are out of the classroom, and most who view the Coach Replay show they're removed from the classroom in a leadership role one way or another. We do have a lot of teacher leaders who view us, and even just teachers as well, who I would argue are also leaders. Everybody really is a leader and a role model for someone, but this was the biggest shift for me when I became a coach with no training on being a coach. Those years ago was what works with my students doesn't always transfer to the adult, because as adults, there are some similarities, but there are also differences in how adult learners and children learners learn. So what can you share with us? I know you've got some resources in the notes and takeaways, but what are your big points that you want to make about understanding adult learners?
I mean, I guess for me, understanding that there are kind of like 6 core principles about adult learners, and there's a graphic that I shared in the references, but really the key ones for me is that, for adults, kind of unlike kids, where they're kind of expecting this process of their learning trajectory involves them being presented with information, them taking it in, because that's kind of the role that's set up. We're the teachers, they're the students. Adults really need to be invested and have to have a reason to want to do what they're doing. And I think, accessing that readiness of like, what is their core reason for being involved? And then what are their behaviors and skills that are showing you that they are also willing to take those next steps in those directions are going to be different for adults than they are for children. And that's because we're different people in the sense that, yes, the way we learn, the way we take in the world. As I age, I realize more and more we're all kids, right? But what I do recognize that is different is this idea that we've stepped away from that like regular practice of the classroom experience of learning for many years as adults, many of us. And so we have to be invested in a different kind of way. And we have to feel shared voice and value. And this is where it connects to that equity and inclusion and the DEIB work is really that, there has to be that shared voice and shared investment, not only from a sense of buy-in, but from a sense that they feel like that they actually have some control over the trajectory of where things are going. So I think that, truly understanding how adults are motivated and how they learn, and then also understanding that, again, going back to what we mentioned in the beginning, using tools like a remote platform, honors these differences in adult learners. We talked about this asynchronous approach, really respecting how an adult takes in information and has time to do coaching. When I started coaching, we were pretty much exclusively doing in vivo coaching. So coaching in real time, we would go in, do our coaching reviews. We would provide a debrief in the classroom. And we were doing that because the staff, or we felt that it was to help the staff from having to commit more time outside of the classroom to this work. But it wasn't necessarily honoring the voice of what they needed. And for some that was appropriate, and for others it was not. And so really looking at adult learners and understanding that they have a diverse set of needs, and, you know, really honoring who the learner is. Again, like you said, getting back to that key of who are we working with? It's a people-based business, this coaching thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, being able to better meet them where they are. And to your point, you know, some of the adults that we work with are far removed from a structured learning experience. So I would venture to bet that everybody is learning at different levels and frequencies. I mean, I hope everybody is learning every day. But I mean, even in and of itself, the coaching model is a different learning structure where there's a lot of stereotypes around kind of what's expected of that my coach is going to be this expert who comes in and tells me what I need to do. And if I just listen to the coach, then I'll be fine. Right. If they're willing to listen, right. If that feels like something that's going to work for them. For some, that very idea alone of an expert coming in and telling me what I should do with my students is, you know, taking all motivation out of it. But to really help our teachers understand that they are an active learner in that, identifying what drives them. I think about Daniel Pink's work and those motivational drivers, just starting to get to know them around and what they want. I mean, a lot of times I'm hired to and given this thing that the principal wants me to work on with a teacher, but I always start out with, what does that teacher want? Like, if you could have support from me, if I could do anything for you or with you, what would that be? What would we focus on? And sometimes there's a disconnect between what the campus leadership thinks the teacher needs and what the teacher thinks they need. And I always argue that they're aligned, but sometimes my job as the coach is to help find that alignment and help move them that way. So yeah, I mean, I think it's really, really valuable as we think about our adult learners. And just sometimes we also have to teach them how to be a student of their own practice, because it's been a long time since they, you know, went through their teaching program and were a student of learning. So yeah, I think that's important too.
Well, what you mentioned, you know, you think about adult learner principles and orientation of learning or solving current problems. For me, that's how it connects, right? Oftentimes you as the coach, your role is figuring out how do you find the language that makes the administration understand that, yes, these teachers are trying to solve the same current problems that the administration is trying to solve. They may be trying to go about it in a different way or using different language to do it. But yeah, I mean, it's really about finding and understanding that what are those driving factors for those adults that we work with. And like you mentioned, you know, much of adult learning is self-directed. So there has to be buy-in. There has to be a feeling of voice and a value for them, because it's not this experience where you're going to provide a worksheet that they fill out and they're going to complete it within 15 minutes and turn it into you to be graded and assessed in classroom.
Right.
So, you know, I think that, you know, as we think about those things, it's really important to constantly be keeping those assumptions or thoughts about adult learning theories in our minds, because it really is what drives them and us to do this work.
Yeah. Well, and I'll argue as well, you know, the generation of learners that are continuing to come through into our educational system are becoming more like these adult learners in they want voice and ownership and again, going back to transferability, if I can provide that type of a learning experience with the adults I work with, they are going to then be more equipped to provide that kind of learning experience to their learners of whatever age. So, you know, again, I think when we talk about student learning, when we talk about equitable practices in the classroom for students, we have to start with our teachers. That's a big role for us as leaders to focus on, but we've got to look inward so we can look outward and down the road. So I love that. Well, Andrew, I think you and I could probably chat forever. So thank you so much. I would love to have you back on the Coach Replay Show, especially to have you come and talk with us about some of your experiences as an early childhood coach. So you and I are going to talk off camera about that, have you back in, because we'll be focusing on some content things this coming the rest of this season. And so I'm super excited to have had you on. Thank you so much for not only being a viewer of the Coach Replay Show, but being one of our guests. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. It was wonderful to be here. And as you know, I am a fan, so I will be in touch.
That's right. Well, if you are now a fan, just like I have been, of Andrew, and you want to figure out how you can connect with Andrew, not just view his resources, but get to connect with him on social media, feel free to please download our notes and takeaways. You can download them right here. If you subscribe to the Coach Replay Show and get it in your inbox every week, it's coming right in there as an attachment. Or you can go to learn.sibme.com and download your notes and takeaways from there. It'll have all of Andrew's social media information so you can learn more from him and all of the wonderful tools he's brought to us today. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe, and have a wonderful new year, everyone. Thanks again, Andrew, for joining us.
Thank you.